Welcome, boys and girls, to Mrs. Ratsoff's Read Aloud. We are starting a new book today. We're going to be reading Chapter 1, just part of Chapter 1, and you can see that I've written the numbers in Roman numerals as well because we have been talking about that. Now, a little while ago, Mr. Gamble asked a question in the school newsletter about some of the teachers and their favorite animals, and I had said mine was the octopus. That is true. The octopus is my favorite sea creature. But I have another favorite animal that's sort of my number one overall favorite animal. So it has 3 letters, the name of this animal. And I want you to take a minute and see if you can take a guess. All right, are you ready? Here it is, owls. Now, I have seen a few animals in nature of these owls I have seen, and I have seen the snowy owl just on the highway close to my home, and I have seen the great horned owl and the barred owl and the barn owl. So I've seen all of those in nature, and sometimes we had people come to school with owls and so on for presentations, and they brought in a barn owl or a barred owl. So I've seen all of those. These are owls from all different parts of the world, and there's many more than this as well. And some of you may recall some of these animals from doing your biome research. The elf owl lives in the desert and makes its home in cactuses. And those people that did the desert biome will remember that. And the burrowing owl makes its home on the prairies, so in grasslands, because it actually burrows underground. Our story today is going to be called Owls in the Family. And this is a Canadian book written by a Canadian author. And a while back I said, sometimes I read books to you that are very old, like Mr. Popper's Penguins was a very old book. This one's not quite as old, but it's pretty old. It was written in 1961 by an author named Farley Mowat, who's a famous Canadian author. All of his books are for adults except for a few, and this is one of the ones that's for children. This is before your parents were born, and this is even before Mrs. Ratsoff was born, so this is a really old book. One May morning, my friend Bruce and I went for a hike on the prairie. Spring was late that year in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Snowdrifts still clung along the steep banks of the river in the shelter of the cottonwood trees. The river was icy with thaw water, and as we crossed over the railroad bridge, we could feel a cold breath rising from it. But we felt another breath, a gentle one, blowing across the distant wheat fields and smelling like warm sun shining on soft mud. It was the spring wind, and the smell of it made us walk faster. We were in a hurry to get out of the city and into the real prairie, where you can climb a fence post and see for about 1,000,000 miles. That's how flat the prairie is. The great thing about Saskatoon was the way it ended sharp all around its edge. There were no outskirts to Saskatoon. When you stepped off the end of the railroad bridge, you stepped right onto the prairie, and there you were, free as the gophers. Gophers were the commonest thing on the prairie. The little mounds of yellow dirt around their burrows were so thick sometimes it looked as if the fields had yellow measles. But this day, Bruce and I weren't interested in gophers. We were looking for an owl's nest. We had decided that we wanted some pet owls. And if you want pet owls, you have to find a nest and get the young ones out of it. We headed for the nearest of the clumps of cottonwood trees that dot the prairies, and which are called bluffs out in Saskatchewan. The ground was spongy under our sneakers, and it swooshed when we hit a wet place. A big jackrabbit bounced up right under my feet and scared me so much I jumped almost as high as he did. And as we came nearer the bluff, 2 crows came zooming out of it and swooped down on us, cawing their heads off. So we'll just take a little break from the story to talk about where this story takes place, the setting. So if you can remember, Find the place on the map where they said the story takes place. And if you chose Saskatchewan, that province in the middle of Canada, you are correct. Think about for a minute if you can remember the name of the city in Saskatchewan where the story takes place. And it is Saskatoon, right in the middle of Saskatchewan. It's not the capital city. The capital city of Saskatchewan is Regina, but Saskatoon is where this story takes place. So that's our setting. And I have been to Saskatoon many times, and actually that's where my brother lives today, just outside of Saskatoon. It's very cold there right now. Now, it talked about the prairie. Saskatchewan is one of our prairie provinces in Canada. And if you looked out your window in Saskatchewan, you might see this. Now, if you drive down the highway in BC, it does not look like this. So I want you to think for a minute what things are missing from this picture that you might see if you were here. Okay, did anybody think of mountains? We see the mountains all the time, wherever we are, and there are no mountains on the prairies. What else might be missing? Towns or cities. Now, there are towns and cities in and on the prairies, but they are much smaller than they are here. And you can travel for a long time without seeing any buildings or cities or towns. There are a lot of small villages, but people who live on farms would see this out their window. What else do you see that is missing that we have a lot of here? Hint, they are green and tall. Right, so they are missing a lot of tall trees. If you go outside in British Columbia, we have so many trees, especially fir trees, the evergreen trees. So all these things are missing. Of course, there are trees on the prairies, but not everywhere. Instead, they have a lot of this, which is called farmland. So flat land that's really good for growing crops like wheat, which is what we use to make bread. So the flour that is made from wheat, that is in your kitchen, that your mom uses to make roti or bread, might come from Saskatchewan. They make other crops, grow other crops as well, barley, oats used for oatmeal and in oatmeal cookies, all kinds of things. So that's what it might look like if you were on the prairies. Now, they mentioned a few animals in the part that we just read, and I want you to look at this top animal up here. And can you remember what he is called? He's awfully cute. He is called a gopher. Sometimes they call them a prairie dog. Now, he doesn't look like much of a dog to me, but that's the other name for them. And they burrow, they have holes in the ground and they have tunnels, and that's where they live. And this guy is standing up nice and alert, ready for danger. If there is danger, he makes a noise, and then all the other gophers go flying down into their tunnels and hide. Now, in the story, the boys were scared by a rabbit, and this particular rabbit is called a jackrabbit. And those of you who had rabbits on your biomes, you know that some of the rabbits had really large ears as an adaptation to release heat. And so jackrabbits definitely look wild. They're not cute and fluffy bunnies like we're used to. And then, of course, we have these on our playground, and they clean up all the scraps you leave behind after recess. We have these guys, which are crows, and they live everywhere in Canada. Bluffs are funny kind of places in the spring. The cottonwood trees shed a kind of white fluffy stuff that looks like snow. Sometimes it's so thick it comes right over the top of your sneakers, and you get a queer feeling that you really are walking through snow, even though the sun on your back is making you sweat right through your shirt. We walked through this bluff, scuffing our feet in the cottonwood snow and stirring it up in clouds. We kept looking up, and after a while, sure enough, we saw a big mess of twigs high up in a poplar. "All right," Bruce said to the two crows, which were swooping and hollering at us. "If you want me to snitch your eggs, I will." With that, he handed me his haversack, which is another word for backpack, and began to shinny up the tree. It was an easy climb because cottonwood poplars always have lots of branches. When he got to the nest and looked into it, I yelled up at him, "Any eggs?" Bruce grinned, but he wouldn't answer. I could see him doing something with his free hand, the one he wasn't holding on with, and I knew. Bluffs are funny kind of places in the spring. The cottonwood trees shed a kind of white fluffy stuff that looks like snow. Sometimes it's so thick it comes right over the top of your sneakers, and you get a queer feeling that you really are walking through snow, even though the sun on your back is making you sweat right through your shirt. We walked through this bluff, scuffing our feet in the cottonwood snow and stirring it up in clouds. We kept looking up, and after a while, sure enough, we saw a big mess of twigs high up in a poplar. "All right," Bruce said to the two crows, which were swooping and hollering at us. "If you want me to snitch your eggs, I will." With that, he handed me his haversack, which is another word for a backpack, and began to shinny up the tree. It was an easy climb because cottonwood poplars always have lots of branches. When he got to the nest and looked into it, I yelled up at him, "Any eggs?" Bruce grinned, but he wouldn't answer. We're just going to pause there for a second so I can show you a picture of a cottonwood tree. So on the prairies, if you have a few cottonwood trees and they're clumped together, they're called a bluff. And on the bottom here, you can see that there is a bunch of white fluffy stuff on the ground, and the cottonwood tree sends its seeds out by dropping this white cottony looking fiber, and inside of it is a little seed, and then the wind blows that cotton fluff around, and that way the seeds can spread everywhere. And that's called snow because it looks like snow. All right. Let's just go back to the other page here for a second. I could see him doing something with his free hand, the one he wasn't holding on with. And I knew, oh, it's not going to let me do this, so I'll speed this up. There we go. Mrs. Ratzlaff's just learning how to use this program, so I could see there were eggs all right. I watched, and sure enough, he was popping them into his mouth so he could carry them down out of the tree. We always carried eggs down out of trees that way. The only thing was, crow's eggs are pretty big, and if you have to stuff 3 or 4 of them into your mouth, it nearly chokes you. Bruce started to climb down. When he got about 10 feet from the ground, he stepped on a rotten branch. Poplar branches are always rotten near the ground, and you have to watch out for them. I guess Bruce forgot. Anyway, the branch broke, and he slid the rest of the way and lit on his seat with a good hard bump. So right now, what I would like you to do is take a moment and try to visualize that. So Bruce has climbed up this tree. He's got 3 or 4 eggs in his mouth, and he's trying not to break them. So he's keeping them all in his mouth at one time. And then can you imagine him stepping on a rotten branch and sliding all the way down the trunk of the tree and then hitting the bottom and landing on his bottom? You can imagine what's going to happen to those eggs. All the eggs had broken, and Bruce was spitting out shells and eggs all over the cottonwood snow. I got laughing so hard I couldn't even talk. When Bruce got most of the eggs spat out, he came for me and tackled me, and we had a fight. It didn't last long because it was too hot to really fight. So Bruce ate a sardine sandwich to get the taste of crow's eggs out of his mouth. And then we started across the prairie again to search through other bluffs until we found an owl's nest. I guess we searched about 100 bluffs that morning, but we never saw an owl. We were getting hungry by then, so we made sort of a nest for ourselves on the ground out of poplar snow and branches. We curled up in it and opened our haversacks. If you can remember what haversacks means, backpacks. Bruce had sandwiches and a lemon in his. He was the only boy I ever knew who liked to eat lemons. He said they were better than oranges any day of the week. I had a hard-boiled egg, and just for fun, I reached over and cracked the shell on Bruce's head. He yelled, and we had another fight and rolled all over his sardine sandwiches. We were just finishing our lunch when a wood gopher came snuffling along through the cottonwood snow. Wood gophers are gray and have big bushy tails. This one came right up to us, and when I held out a crust to him, he shuffled up and took it out of my hand. "Got no sense," said Bruce. "You might have been a coyote, and then where'd he be at?" "Heck," I said, "he's got more sense than you. Do I look like a coyote?" The gopher didn't say anything. He just took the crust and scuttled away to his hole somewhere. We picked up our haversacks. The sun was as bright as fireworks, and the sky was so clear you could look right through it, like looking through a blue window. We started to walk. All of a sudden, Bruce stopped so fast that I bumped into him. "Looky," he said, and pointed to a bluff about half a mile away. There must have been 1,000,000 crows around it. It looked as if the bluff was on fire and filling the sky with black smoke. That's how many crows there were. When you see a bunch of crows all yelling their heads off at something, you can almost bet it's an owl they're after. Crows and owls hate each other, and when a crow spots an owl, he'll call every other crow for miles, and they'll all join in and mob the owl. We headed for that bluff at a run. The crows saw us coming, but they were too excited to pay much attention. We were nearly deaf with their racket by the time we reached the edge of the trees. I was ahead of Bruce when I saw something big and slow go drifting out of one poplar into another. It was a great horned owl, the biggest kind of owl there is. And as soon as it flew, the whole lot of crows came swooping down on it, cawing like fury. I noticed they were careful not to get too close. Now we're just going to take a minute to try to visualize that. In part 2 of our story next time, I'm going to show you the picture from the book and what it looks like when there is a bunch of crows all together. Now there's a name for a bunch of crows when they're all together, just like we call a flock of birds. A group of birds is called a flock. A group of rhinoceroses is called a crash. And a group of orcas would be called a pod. So your little homework challenge for today is to find out what a group of crows is called. And it is a really cool name. So we will see you next time for the second part of Chapter 1.